In the months that followed their retreat from the valley, things were as difficult for the rebel army as all Rendorn had predicted. Pressing farther into the western hills made it too dangerous for the usurpers' forces to follow, but left them in harsh territory with little food or supplies. They fished in the mountain streams and hunted in the thin forest, but still the men hovered just short of starvation. With few proper tents, few blankets, and fewer ways to stay occupied and entertained, they were scattered, restless, and short of nearly everything. Nor were they left alone for those months. Small groups of the king's soldiers made occasional forays into the hills to probe the rebel defenses, a threat that kept the rebels vigilant. Stretched to the point of exhaustion, they found it more and more difficult to maintain a watchful eye. When a small group of enemy soldiers made it right to the command tent and were taken down by guards not 20 feet from where Maric ate his scant dinner, all Rendorn determined that they could no longer afford to just stay hidden within the hills. It was Loghain who led the first small groups of archers out under cover of darkness. Elves naturally saw better in darkness than men, so he recruited those few that marched with the rebels as runners and camp followers to join his group. Though surprised by their sudden elevation, they quickly stepped up to the challenge. Within weeks, they had racked up an impressive body count, enough so the enemy began to fear the appearance of the night elves in their camps. It was a name Loghain took for his group as a badge of courage. The enemy could not react effectively to these constant strikes, spread out as they were in their struggle to keep the rebels enclosed in the hills and starving. More attacks followed as Rowan led her horsemen in raids during the day. Should the enemy dare to try to follow her men back into the hills, Maric and the Arl would ambush them in the narrow passes. The rebels were taking losses, but they were exacting a toll from the enemy in far greater numbers. As they were stretched to the breaking point, it came as a great relief when their scouts finally reported that the enemy was pulling back from the hills to a safer distance. Within days, the Arl gave the order to march, and the army was split into 4 groups that slipped through the northern passes under a full moon. It was a tense night, the march made slow by the lack of torchlight, but in the end they were successful. The outlying enemy camps did not detect their movement, and by dawn the army was almost to the southern shores of Great Lake Calenhad. Here there were numerous friendly farmholds that were willing to barter and even provide a little secret assistance. Riders were sent out to several of the local villages, and even as far as Redcliffe, to quietly gather supplies. The celebration when the first of those supplies started arriving to the camp was as spontaneous as it was jubilant. The mere appearance of soap was enough to send Rowan and Maric into a mad display of joy. Biting into a fresh apple seemed heavenly. Fresh linens appeared, along with new tents and medicine. That evening there was music and laughter and dancing around the campfires, and for a single night there was war. And for a single night the war was forgotten. All Rendorn awarded Loghain the rank of lieutenant and commissioned the Night Elves as an actual company. Reluctant to accept the honor, Loghain did so only after being cajoled by his fellow archers and teased by Rowan. Maric presented the red cloak of his rank to him in a brief ceremony in front of the collected army. Loghain looked distinctly uncomfortable throughout, disparaging the need for such a display, but the resulting cheer from the men was so vigorous, not even he could deny the positive effect it had on the morale. Reasons to celebrate were, after all, few and far between. The rebel army had lost a great number of its men, and it became apparent that much of Ferelden assumed rebellion had died within its queen. It was a notion that the usurper worked hard to spread. Still, there were those who knew better and were willing to offer help, no matter how surreptitious. After months spent traveling along the mountains and then eastward across the hilly coastlands, the army found shelter in the gentle forest near the coastal part of Amaranthine. Whatever his reasons, all Byron of Amaranthine ignored their presence and quietly let it be known that they could remain for now. It was not the first time the rebels had needed to rely on someone looking the other way, so Maric accepted all Byron's generosity, for now. To Maric, their primary task was to regain their lost momentum. This meant splitting up so they could cover more ground, spreading the word, at least for a time, and though all Rendorn seemed grave at the risk it represented, he agreed that the effort was necessary. Loghain and Rowan and Loghain rode out first, though their pairing naturally didn't come without argument. Neither of them was inclined to leave Maric's side, nor did they particularly relish the idea of traveling together. But in the end, Maric's insistence won them out. They reluctantly left the camp, taking with them a handful of men who were familiar with the Banorn, the fertile heartlands of central Ferelden. For months they traveled together, camping where possible, while Rowan and Loghain made short trips into nearby villages to spread what word they could. Occasionally, they would make a visit to one of the local bands who they felt might be receptive to overtures. Rowan found herself impressed by Loghain's ability to quickly assess whether a band was legitimately interested or just eager to gain favor with the king by trying to trap them. Once she had become infuriated with Loghain as he pulled her away from a dinner table without explanation, only to belatedly realize that guards had been quietly maneuvering in the shadows. He had seen it coming, not her. Blades were bared, and the two of them were forced to fight back to back in order to escape capture. In such situations, Loghain never once treated her as if she required saving or any sort of special protection. He expected her sword arm to be as strong as his own, and she made sure it was. Once they had been in the area for too long, they usually moved on quickly, often chased by agents of noblemen or another. There seemed to be no shortage of those who were willing to sell out their rightful ruler, especially when it seemed the usurper had all but won. Occasionally, Rowan's heart felt pleased would find a ready audience among bands whose fortunes had dwindled and who remembered better days. Though allegiance had taken a harsh toll on the Banorn, their taxes plundering the countryside as surely as an army. Fear, however, made many hesitant to consider helping the rebels, especially when they might be a lost cause. Too many graphic examples had been made by the usurper, rotting carcasses hung in cages at nearly every fork in the road, glaring examples of imperial justice. Still, the will of the Ferelden people was not completely broken, and Rowan and Loghain saw evidence of their stubbornness and independence during those months of traveling the Heartland. Men with little more than rags on their backs and skin on their bones would listen as Loghain told them of Prince Maric's survival, and their eyes would shine with a fierce determination, a hope that perhaps not all was lost. Old men would spit angrily into tavern fireplaces and speak of the days when Maric's grandfather still ruled, of the great war with Orlais and the bitter defeat that followed. Those listening in the flickering shadows would nod their heads grimly, and one or two would quietly approach Rowan and Loghain afterwards. The belligerence Rowan remembered from first meeting Loghain gradually vanished, though she was not quite certain why, and was replaced by something that varied between gentlemanly courtesy and indifference. Loghain was quiet to begin with, but just as Rowan believed he was warming toward her, he would promptly cool. In fact, the only time Loghain said anything to her of real significance came on an evening in the middle of winter. They were camping in the woods to avoid a pair of bounty hunters that Rowan was certain had been hired by Ban Siorlik, both of them huddled on opposite sides of the tiny campfire, shivering in their woolen blankets. Their breath came out in white plumes, and Rowan considered once again asking for the fire to be built up. Undoubtedly, Loghain's response would be a stern frown. It would give away their position, she knew that, but freezing to death simply didn't seem like a helpful alternative. Rowan glanced across the fire and then realized that Loghain was staring at her. He said nothing, and the intensity in those icy blue eyes made her heart skip. She looked away quickly, wrapping the blanket around her more tightly as she shuddered. How long had he been staring at her so quietly? "I haven't thanked you," he stated. She looked up confused. "Thanked me?" "Back at the battle, you rode to my rescue," he smiled grimly. "Quite literally, in fact." "There's no need to." "There is," he cut her off. She watched with fascination as he took a deep breath and then stared straight into her eyes, as if he wanted to be certain she understood his sincerity. "I know what you did, and I'm grateful. I should have told you so before." The cold went away. Loghain nodded curtly, having made his peace and quietly turned his attention back to the fire. He went back to warming himself like nothing had happened, and she had no idea what to say in response, so she said nothing. In the end, it made little difference, for they had much to do during the months they were on the road. Often they struggled just to stay alive. Rowan preferred traveling companions who were more personable, perhaps, but she could not deny that Loghain's competence saved her from real troubles many times over. If he had ever owed her anything for her defying her father, he repaid it with interest. She could see why Maric was so keen on him. Maric, meanwhile, was also spending months on the road. Throughout the winter, he traveled secretly with the mage Wilhelm and a small honor guard to visit nobles who had been friendly to the rebels previously. He went to remind them that the rebellion was not over and to urge them to consider throwing their lot in with the army. The lesson of his mother's death was still fresh in his mind, of course. He never trusted his safety to any of these men and women, despite their past associations. Times were desperate, and if the queen could be fooled into thinking men like Ban Siorlik were genuine, then so could he. Every meeting was a carefully arranged affair, the ill-tempered mage fretting right up until it took place. On the few occasions that one of the nobles tried to ambush him, the sudden appearance of Wilhelm's stone golem made short work of the attackers. The main thing that helped Maric during those long months was the usurper's unpopularity. By ruling through fear, Megrin made no secret of his antipathy towards his own subjects. This meant most of those Maric sought out were at least willing to listen and offer sympathy even if they were skeptical of actually joining the rebel cause. Joining the cause, after all, meant abandoning one's home. It meant having one's ancestral lands handed over to an Elysian lord who would bleed them dry, and many of the nobles were reluctant to subject their people to such treatment. No, only the truly desperate and those without options joined the rebels. What made Maric optimistic, as well as sad, was that as the months passed, it became apparent that more and more nobles were being pushed to that extreme. Already, Maric had heard of bands that had been forced off their estates and took what men they could muster and made for the rebel army. King Megrin might have gained an Orlesian ally in whatever lord he handed their land to, but Maric gained a loyal and determined rebel as a result. Real trouble came in the spring. Once rumor had begun to circulate of a small group of strange travelers with a conspicuous golem moving through the hinterland roads. When the usurper's men descended upon them, Maric was forced to flee for his life. Wilhelm insisted they return to the army, but instead Maric veered north and made the journey to Kinloch Hold, the ancient tower that was home of the Circle of Magi. The spire rose impossibly out of Lake Calenhad, the impressive remnants of the old imperial highway still leading out of it, even though boats were required to actually reach the tower today. The mages were ostensibly neutral in any political conflict, and the first enchanter received Maric nervously at the tower entrance. He was a tiny man, almost wizened in his advanced age, and he informed Maric in a tremulous voice that the Grand Cleric was in attendance at the same time. The implication was clear. The Chantry didn't yet know about Maric's arrival. The mages would be more than happy if he simply moved on, nobody the wiser. Their concern was understandable enough. The Chantry watched the Circle of Magi closely and offered them no trust whatsoever. If there was even a suspicion of any involvement by the mages with the rebellion, the Chantry's Templars would be unleashed upon them. Very likely even Wilhelm's presence was cause for alarm. Still, Maric had never met Mother Bronach previously. He knew her only by reputation. When else was he ever going to have a chance to meet the woman when she wouldn't be flanked by an army of Templars? The first enchanter blanched when Maric explained his intention. Maric almost felt sorry for the man. After a great deal of fuss and many terse messages sent back and forth to the Grand Cleric's entourage, Maric was finally ushered alone into the vaulted assembly chamber at the heart of the tower. It was an impressive room, great columns reaching up to a ceiling of 100 feet, while small glass bulbs dangled and glowed with dim magic to form a star-like array of overhead. Normally, It served as a forum of debate of the senior mages, but today it would serve as neutral ground. The Grand Cleric sat stiffly by herself, wrapped in her glittering red robes, and rhythmically tapped her withered fingers on her chair. As he approached, she eyed him accusingly, but did not deign to acknowledge him otherwise. He was sweating profusely. How very large the chamber was for just the two of them. He felt dwarfed and somehow insignificant. "Prince Maric," she said with forced politeness as he reached her. He fell to one knee and lowered his head in a show of respect. "Mother Bronick." A tense silence ensued, after which Maric rose to his feet again. The priest regarded him with interest, not entirely displeased by his display. "You are fortunate," she began crisply, "that I am not here with a proper honor guard. I would have taken you prisoner immediately. Surely you understand that." "We wouldn't be talking if that were the case." "Indeed." She tapped her fingers on the chair again, and Mary got the feeling that she was studying him, looking for a weakness, perhaps, trying to see if he matched his no doubt lacking reputation. He wasn't sure. "Are you an Andrastian boy, a believer in the Maker and his chantry?" He nodded. "My mother taught me the chant of light." "Then submit to the proper ruler of Ferelden. End this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," he snapped. How can the chantry support putting a legion on Ferelden's throne?" Her eyebrows shot up. Mother Bronick was not accustomed to contradiction, he surmised. "It is the Maker's will," she said with belabored patience. "He is a tyrant." She paused, pursing her lips as she watched him. "How many innocent lives had your mother wasted in this hopeless struggle? How many will you? Do your people not deserve peace?" Maric felt rage bubbling up from within him and threatening to explode. How dare she? He closed the distance between them, marching up to her chair and stopping directly in front of her, fists clenched at his sides. It was all he could do to stop himself from throttling her. She still deserved respect despite her arrogance. He had to remind himself of that. He breathed out slowly, forcing himself to calm. Mother Bronick watched him, seemingly undaunted by his proximity and his unspoken threat. He could tell that she was nervous, however. He could see the bead of sweat on her forehead, watch as her eyes flicked toward the nearby doors. "Is it true," he asked icily, "that he put my mother's head on a spear outside the dinner room palace? My mother, your rightful queen?" A long minute passed as they locked gazes. Finally, Mother Bronick rose imperiously out of her chair. "I can see there is nothing for us to discuss," she said with just the slightest quaver in her voice. "You are an impertinent boy. I suggest you take your men and leave while you can, and pray to the Maker that when your end comes you receive more mercy than your mother did." With that, she turned and strode out of the room. Maric's knees turned to jelly as she left. Maric's brief meeting with the first enchanter that followed fared little better. The circle of magi were unwilling to abandon their neutrality. At best, they were willing to tactfully overlook the fact that one of their own was helping the rebels. Maric supposed he couldn't expect more than that. The entire trip to the tower had done little for the rebel cause. Still, meeting the Grand Cleric face to face must have been worth something, he thought. Even if she had thought him rude and unready, at least he had looked her in the eye, one of the closest advisors to the usurper, and not buckled. She had left Kinlochhold in a hurry, no doubt, headed at full speed back to the palace. Maric was going from the Shining Tower long before she could send anyone back to capture him. The reunion in the forest near Amaranthine was a glad one. All Rendorn greeted Maric as he returned, as well as Rowan and Loghain. All of them were exhausted, but pleased the others had returned safely. Rowan ran forward to embrace Maric happily and tease him about the beard he had grown over the winter, and if Loghain looked on silently. Neither of them noticed. Maric was eager to hear the stories of the months spent in the Bannorn And that first evening back at the camp, he stayed up until the small hours, drinking and extracting one reluctant tale after another out of Loghain. It proved to be the only reprieve they would have for some time. All Rendon had already been warned the army's position was becoming too well known. They had remained in one place far longer than they had ever previously. Small bands of recruits had been making their way to the forest over the months, and word had spread. And when a secret messenger arrived from the All of Amaranthine to tell them the usurpers' forces were on their way, they started packing up quickly. Maric told all Rendon that he had only one thing to do first. He took Loghain with him and paid a visit to All Byron. Loghain suggested that he was foolish to do so, but Maric didn't care. The young All came out of his estate at Amaranthine as they approached, flanked by his guards. He waved amiably to Maric. "Your Highness," he greeted them. "I have to admit I'm a bit surprised to still see you here. Did you not receive my message?" Maric nodded. "I did, Your Grace. I wanted to thank you for sending it." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "It was the least I could do." "The very least," Loghain growled emphatically. Maric shot an angry look at Loghain, who scowled out but otherwise remained unrepentant. "My point," he stated, looking back at the All Byron, "was that we are grateful for the months you have provided us safe harbor. I hope nothing ill comes to you as a result." He bowed deeply to the Earl, who appeared nonplussed and did little beyond muttering polite niceties as Maric and Loghain withdrew. Certainly, Maric never expected much from it. If anything, the Earl's confused response forced Maric to grudgingly agree with Loghain's assessment that they might have simply been better off not making the attempt. So when the rebel army began its march the next morning, Maric was shocked to encounter a force of soldiers wearing amaranthine heraldry just as they left the forest bounds. The soldiers had not come to attack, however. All Byron rode to the front of his men and quietly, in front of them all, bent knee to Maric. "The usurper can take my land," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've sent my wife and children to the north and brought with me what loyal men I have and all the supplies I could gather." As he looked up at Maric, tears welled in his eyes. If my Lord Prince will have me, I would gladly offer my service to the rebellion, and I beg your forgiveness for not having the courage to offer it sooner." Maric was rendered speechless, and it wasn't until both the Earl's men and his own began cheering that he remembered to accept. Battles followed. First, as the rebel army sought to evade the usurper's men as they headed back west into the hills, and then as all Rendon decided that they needed to take the offense. A series of small battles fought mostly in the spring rains sent the usurper's unprepared forces into a hasty retreat. A larger force that enraged Megran had hastily assembled arrived weeks later, but by then the rebel army had already moved on. In the lean 2 years that followed, that was how the rebel army stayed alive. True battles were few and far between. However, and life with the rebels primarily consisted of waiting. Weeks were spent camping in the rain or snowed in during the winter, waiting for the enemy to find them or waiting for the opportunity to attack. When they weren't waiting, they were marching, trudging through the most remote parts of Ferelden to flee a larger enemy force or to find a new place to hide and wait. Only once did the usurper gain a serious advantage over them. A lightly armored caravan bringing supplies from Orlais in the early winter proved too tempting a target, and only too late did all Rendon realize it was a trap. Before the rebels knew it, hundreds of Orlesian chevaliers rode out from the hills, hidden amid the rocks, their silvery armor and lances glittering against the snow. They would have flanked the bulk of the rebel force and pinned it there until more forces arrived had Loghain and the Night Elves not acted quickly. Loghain and Elves ran into the hills in order to intercept the Chevalier charge. Peppering the knights with arrows forced them to stop and deal with the archers instead of finishing their flanking maneuver. Lightly armored elves were no match for the Chevaliers, however, and more than half of them were slaughtered as the Orlesians overran their position. Loghain himself was gored by a lance. The sacrifice gave Maric time to call off the attack on the caravan, and the rebels pulled back to safety. Insisting on going to Loghain's rescue, Maric brought the rebel forces around to clash directly with the Chevaliers in the hills. The casualties were high, but both the wounded Loghain and the surviving Night Elves were saved before all Rendor finally called for the retreat. The Chevaliers gave chase, but eventually desisted before the rebel armies turned the tables. The trap had not succeeded. Other battles were chosen more carefully. All Rendor was the one who did the choosing most times, and when he and Maric would differ in opinion, it ended up as an argument. In the end, the All's long experience would always win out. These lost arguments were not things that Maric took in stride. For days afterwards, he would stay out of sight, spending his time brooding and bristling at the idea that he was not being taken seriously. He complained of being treated like a figurehead, though the All repeatedly told him this wasn't so. Once, Maric walked in on a meeting of the All and both Rowan and Loghain, and belatedly realized that he had not been invited. He spent almost a week drunk and miserable, avoiding everyone until finally Loghain tracked him down and told him he was being an idiot and physically dragged him back to the camp. For whatever reason, this seemed to mollify Maric considerably. After that, Maric made an effort to ensure his presence was felt in other ways. Adamant that he would share the danger with his men, he insisted on fighting on the front lines in every battle. The soldiers watched him ride along the front, purple cloak billowing and dwarven armor shining brilliantly, and they worshipped him. He gave no indication if he knew just how much. Rowan got truly upset on those occasions when Maric was carried in from the field, bleeding profusely from a horrible sword gash. Wilhelm would immediately come running and use his healing magic, even as Rowan shouted furiously. Maric would grin through the pain and tell her she was making far too much of it. Then Loghain invariably arrived from the battle, still armored and covered in blood and sweat. He would take one look at Maric, frown thoughtfully, and declare that since Maric came out of the fight alive, all was well. Rowan would storm off, ranting about their idiocy, while Maric and Loghain shared a private grin at her expense. The three of them slowly became closer over the 2 years. They fought together in battle, and all Rendor included Loghain in planning discussions more and more. Indeed, the All increasingly praised Loghain's abilities, and one suggested that if Loghain's father had been the one to train Loghain, it was a tragedy he had ever left the service of the throne. Things might have been different, and the All had said, and he would have been like, things might have been different, the All said, and he would have liked, things might have been different, the All said, and he would have liked to have met the man. Loghain accepted the compliment with his usual stoic silence, his thoughts unknown to anyone but himself. With the long weeks spent camped, Loghain devoted a great deal of time training Maric on the finer points of swordsmanship and archery. He claimed Maric was a poor student, but the truth was their training sessions became an excuse to spend time with each other's He claimed Maric was a poor student, but the truth was their training sessions became an excuse to spend time. He claimed Maric was a poor student, but the truth was their training sessions became an excuse to spend time in each other's company. Maric found Loghain endlessly fascinating, repeatedly trying to pry a story out of the tight-lipped man regarding his days as an outlaw, asking and insisting until he relented out of pure exasperation. Maric's endless supply of charm was apparently capable of wearing down almost anyone, and it wasn't long before Maric and Loghain were a constant sight together on the practice field. Rowan often watched the training sessions, amused by the constant bickering and banter between Maric and Loghain. Outside of the Night Elves, Loghain was regarded as a taciturn and eventually unfriendly man. Maric had a way of drawing him out, she noted, which she had been unable to do during their months traveling to Banorn. Often she laughingly criticized Loghain's sword techniques, primarily because it nettled Loghain and thus vastly amused Maric. Loghain became so incensed by Rowan's comments that, seething with anger, he challenged her to a duel to prove which of them knew more of swordsmanship. Grinning, she accepted. Maric was incredibly excited by the entire idea and immediately ran about the rebel camp announcing that the duel was about to occur. Within an hour, Loghain and Rowan had an audience of hundreds of cheering men. Leery of the size of their audience, Loghain turned to Rowan. Do you truly wish to pursue this? He asked her, his expression solemn. I believe it was you who challenged me. Then I withdraw the challenge, he said instantly, and I apologize for losing my temper. It will not happen again. Amid the boos and sounds of disappointment made by the soldiers nearby who had heard him, Rowan appeared nettled instead. I do not accept your withdrawal, she replied, provided you fight me to the best of your ability. You want to see which of us knows how to use our sword better? So do I. Loghain stared at her appraisingly, wondering if she was, in fact, serious. She said nothing, instead drawing her blade and returning his stare defiantly. After a long minute, he finally nodded his assent, cheers growing up from the crowd. Loghain was the stronger of the two, but Rowan was the quicker and perhaps the more determined. Their initial feints drew loud cheers from the audience. Then they settled into a series of back-and-forth blows to test the other's defenses. Rowan soon realized that Loghain was holding back, however, and angrily dived in with a blindingly fast slash, cutting him across the leg. He waved off aid, staring sternly at Rowan for a moment before nodding. If this was how she wanted it, this is how it would be. The following battle lasted almost an hour and was the talk of the camp for months afterwards. Loghain and Rowan fought savagely, each giving as good as they got, and both of them were bloody before long. A slash across Rowan's forehead sent blood dripping into her eyes and gave Loghain the opportunity to go for the final blow, which he took. Only at the last second did she roll out of the way, then tipped her sword toward him respectfully. With both exhausted and sweating, a worried Maric tried to end the duel by calling a draw. Not looking away from Loghain, Rowan waved them off. Minutes later, it was over when Loghain came in low and unexpectedly thrust upward with his blade, disarming Rowan. The audience murmured excitedly as her blade skittered far out of her reach. Instead of giving up or going for her weapon, Rowan dropped down and kicked out with her leg, tripping Loghain, and leaped to grab his sword. The two of them fought for control of the blade, rolling around on the ground, their sweat and blood intermingling. Finally, Loghain kicked Rowan off, the audience cheering as he rolled after her and sprang to his feet. Sword pointed at Rowan's throat. She glanced at the sword, her breathing ragged and blood still running down into her eyes. Loghain was similarly panting, pale and favoring his wounded leg. He held out a hand to Rowan, and reluctantly she took it, allowing him to pour it to her feet. The audience went wild, cheering with approval. They got even louder when Rowan shook Loghain's hand, congratulating him. She then wavered weakly and stumbled, and Maric scrambled to catch her. She chuckled as he called for Wilhelm, telling him that perhaps Loghain was good enough tutor for him after all. Later, as Maric stood outside the tent where Wilhelm was busy healing Rowan, Loghain limped up, freshly bandaged, and stiffly apologized. He had let his pride get the better of him, he said, and very nearly hurt the future queen. Maric listened, wide-eyed, and then laughed heartily. From where he stood, he said, it seemed like the opposite had very nearly been true. Loghain merely nodded gravely, and that was where the matter was left. As spring meddled the snowdrifts led by a hard winter, Maric remarked to himself that it had been almost 3 years since his mother was murdered, and he returned to the rebel army for that fateful battle. As slow as their progress had been since then, the rebel army managed to survive and continued to frustrate the usurpers' efforts to corner and eliminate them. If anything, their numbers had increased. Magrin was a merciless ruler, and the more he taxed and the more he punished, the more ranks of the rebel army swelled. They had reached a size where they couldn't even afford to be in the same region all at the same time. Even with the support of many farm holders, it was becoming difficult for the army to feed itself. So, too, had the risk of taking in informants become too high. The speed with which the usurpers' forces find out where the rebels were camped increased with each passing month. The time had come to act. The town of Gwen was a remote place on the southeast corner of Ferelden, past the great tracts of the Brazilian forest. A rough town full of loggers and fishermen, it was accessible to the rest of the country only by boat or along the narrow trail leading through the miles of forest land to the west. It was a defensible place, but all Rendon had ascertained that the majority of its forces were off in the north. Levies supplied by the ruling tyrant of Gwyn to the usurper to help hunt the rebels. This meant the town was ripe for the taking. Weeks earlier, the outlaw Amaranthine and his men had split off from the main force. He had gone westward to engage in raiding and to draw the attention of the king's forces in the region toward him. Maric assumed he had been successful, as they encountered no pursuit when moving through the forest toward Gwyn. By the time they reached the town, it was apparent the defenders had become aware of their approach, but had little time to do more than rouse their militia. A number of the locals had fled on fishing boats, but most were trapped. The assault began quickly. The town was spread among the rocky shore, a veritable maze of cobbled streets and plaster-covered brick. It had no wall, but it did have a stone manor atop the hill that overlooked the town, and that was where the majority of the tyrant's men had withdrawn. Maric and Rowan charged down from the forest and into the town itself, meeting a line of poorly trained militia that tried to keep them out. Very quickly things had fallen to chaos. The militia fell back almost immediately, withdrawing into the alleyways and the buildings and forcing the rebels to search for them, building to building. Despite Maric's insistence on not causing more destruction and hardship for the townsfolk, several fires began to spread. He could see the smoke rising, and the panic of the populace made the search difficult. People were running in the streets, fleeing from the rebels and the militia both. They carried the few valuables they could manage and ran for the forest, hoping that the rebel army would ignore them. The streets were a mass of people, all smoke and screams everywhere, and after turning a corner, Maric realized he was separated from his own men. His warhouse stamped in agitation. His war horse stamped in agitation, and he fought to bring it under control as a group of people came through the smoke toward him. They halted, terrified. Dressed in simple clothes, many were carrying belongings wrapped in cloth, and several had children hiding behind them. Not more militiamen. He moved his horse aside and waved them by. Attentively they went. One of the children burst into frightened tears. More smoke billowed through the streets, and he had heard the sound of fighting ahead. The port was not far away, and he was certain that some of his soldiers would be there, but as he turned his horse about, he found he had no idea which direction that might be. Just follow the smell of salt and fish, he told himself. But all he could do was smell smoke and blood. 3 more men came out of the smoke toward him, this time running and shouting. Maric spun his mount around to face them and saw that they belonged to the militia. They were armored in dark leather and carried small wooden shields and cheap swords. That they charged at a mounted man in full armor probably meant that they recognized the cloak and thought they might drag him from his horse and overwhelm him. Come to think of it, they just might, he thought. He dismounted smoothly and drew his sword, getting the weapon up just in time to knock aside the first man's thrust, but not in time to prevent the first man from slamming into him. Thrown back into a brick wall, Maric had the air knocked from him, even though his dwarven armor took most of the impact. Maric's horse backed off but did not run, neighing anxiously. "Get on him! Get on him!" the man shouted excitedly, spittle flying from his mouth. A fat and balding fellow whose leathers barely covered his belly slammed his sword down on Maric's shoulder, though it merely bounced off. Maric gritted his teeth and kicked out at the first man, sending him stumbling away, and then turned around and punched the fat man in the face before he could bring his sword down again. Maric's gauntlet took him right in the nose, and he screamed as blood sprayed out. The third man rushed him, blade ready, but Maric parried and spun around, then ran him through. The fat man reeled and ran away, covering his face while he squealed in agony. The first man scrambled to his feet and lifted his blade as Maric turned to face him. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other, their swords at the ready. Maric was calm, but the man licked his lips nervously and clearly wanted to run. More smoke poured into the street as a nearby roof collapsed and flames licked the sky. "Still waiting to try?" Behind the man, 4 new militia soldiers ran into view. Some were bloody, and all of them halted as they spotted the confrontation occurring before them. Seeing his comrades, the man in front of Maric suddenly grinned at him. "I think I just might," he snickered. Then Maric heard a new sound, hooves pounding on the cobblestone. The four soldiers realized they were being chased and began shouting in fear and running forward again, only not quick enough. Several horses with armored riders overran them, blades slashing down and dispatching them instantly. One of the riders was Rowan, her green plume fluttering behind her. She rushed ahead of the soldiers, her sword held high. The soldier in front of Maric stared at her dumbly, mouth hanging open, and only belatedly did he think to try to run. It was too late. Rowan ran him down, slicing him deftly across the throat. Maric grimly watched the man stumble and then slow, his dark blood gushing over the cobblestones. It was unnecessary, he thought to himself. These soldiers were his people too, were they not? But there was nothing he could do about it. Not yet. The horses clattered to a stop as Rowan pulled up beside Maric. She removed her helmet, her face covered in soot and sweat. "Fall off your horse again?" she asked with just a hint of a mocking grin. "It's what I do," he agreed with a belabored sigh. He hadn't actually fallen off his horse for several years now, except for that one time the previous winter when he had ended up buried in the snowbank. It had saved his life, hiding him from the enemy until Loghain reached him and pulled him out. Loghain had called him absurdly lucky, and Maric had agreed through chattering teeth. Loghain and Rowan both continued to tease him about it mercilessly. Maric turned and walked back to where his horse had retreated, taking its reins and calming it before leaping back into the saddle. Rowan watched him appreciatively before she glanced back at the horsemen waiting behind her. With a gesture, they rode off to continue their sweep. "We've still got the part of the town to search," she said. "It will probably take the rest of the night to find them. I was hoping they would start coming out and surrendering." She nodded to the various fires around them. "But it looks like they would rather burn half of Gwen down around our ears first." "So it seems." Maric wiped the sweat off his brow. He wiped his bloody sword clean using a hay bundle that stood nearby. "Last I saw, the fighting was going well up at the manor. Loghain broke the wall, I think." Rowan looked annoyed, as she tended to whenever he mentioned Loghain. She had denied doing so when challenged, so now he just ignored it. "So Gwen is ours then?" she asked crisply. "Soon it will be." Rowan waved to her men to continue on without her, and they rode off, leaving Maric and Rowan to survey the town together. The area they were in had quieted considerably. Several blazes were going, but most of those who had decided to flee were long gone, and most of the enemy in the area had already been found. Maric felt helpless watching the buildings burn, knowing that the fire would spread unchecked for some time yet. He could see the faces cowering behind the windows, watching Rowan and him as they rolled past, but he could hardly expect them to come out now. Later, perhaps, but for now he was the invader, the one responsible for the bloodshed and fires. Perhaps some even believed him to be the villain that King Megrin claimed. Most were no doubt justifiably terrified. The streets were strewn with litter, as well as the occasional corpse. Many doors were hanging open or outright demolished, and surprisingly there seemed to be chickens everywhere. Where had they come from? Had someone let them loose? The birds were furious, strutting about the streets as if they were the true owners of Gwen now. Thunder rumbled in the sky, and Rowan studied the swatch of gray clouds. "We can hope for rain," she said. "That should help with the fires." There was another sound, however, that drew Maric's attention. From somewhere nearby, he could hear the muffled sounds of a woman shouting for help. "Do you hear that?" he asked Rowan, but she looked at him quizzically. Without waiting for her, he spun his horse about and charged toward the shouting. Maric heard Rowan's shout of alarm behind him, but he didn't care. Urging his steed forward, he raced down the street cluttered with empty crates. When he turned around the corner at what appeared to be an alehouse, he saw the source of the shouts. A beautiful elven woman with long, honey-colored curls and dressed in simple white traveling clothes was struggling wildly as three men held her down. Her shirt was half ripped from her body, and only her wild twisting kept the men from completing their task. "For the love of the Maker, help me! I beg you!" she screamed, spotting Maric. Only one of the burly men slapped a meaty hand over her mouth as the other two turned to face Maric. These weren't his men, and he couldn't imagine them being ordinary townsfolk. Convicts, perhaps? They were certainly filthy enough and had a dangerous look that left no question as to what they intended. One of them drew a knife. Maric didn't hesitate. He kicked his warhorse so it charged the men. The knife-wielding man lunged toward Maric. His mistake. Maric turned the warhorse and kicked it, and it kicked the man right in the head and sent him flying, dead before he hit the ground. "You will leave her be," Maric roared. He dismounted, drawing his blade to confront the remaining pair as his steed ran off. "In the name of the crown, I command it!" The burly man tightened his grip on the elf as he struggled, screaming into his hand. The other man bared his teeth and ran at Maric, shouting in rage. Maric did not step out of the way, instead stepping forward and letting the man run into the pommel of his sword. He gasped and fell back, and Maric swung the blade around to bash the man in the head with the pommel again. He collapsed like a sack. Rowan rode in, leaping off her mount and drawing her sword. The burly man looked at Maric and then ran at her, and deciding that discretion was the better option. He abandoned the elf and ran for it. Rowan gave chase, her silent glare toward Maric saying everything of what she thought of the situation. Maric went immediately to the elven woman's aid. She lay in the street trying to hold the tatters of her shirt together and crying pitifully. Her clothing was filthy and blood-stained, but Maric didn't think the blood was hers. Other than some ugly-looking bruises on her arms and legs, she seemed unhurt. "Are you all right, my lady?" Maric realized belatedly he wasn't sure what one called an elven woman. They had elves in the rebel army, of course, but one spoke to them as soldiers. He'd never had servants, though he'd seen some of them in the castles mother had brought him to. Still, even then, he'd never spoken to them. The elf looked up at him, tears streaming down from the eyes so incredibly green he couldn't look away. "My name is Catriel," she said quietly. "You are too kind, your highness. Thank you." With his help, she retrieved the cloth package from where it had fallen nearby. As she stood up, she attempted to keep her tattered shirt together. It was hardly possible. Maric removed his purple cloak and put it around her shoulders. She stared at him with horror and tried to get away from his cloak. "Oh, no, my lord, I couldn't." "Of course you can, it's just a cloak." Reluctantly, she allowed him to close it around her, blushing and looking away. Maric found himself staring at her neck and how it gracefully flowed down into ample cleavage, only barely concealed by the cloak. She seemed like such a delicate creature. He had heard that elven women had a certain fascination for men, the kind that made them popular in brothels of Denerim. He had never been to the capital city, however, and had never understood he had never been to the capital city, however, and had never understood what the appeal could be until now. He started as Rowan walked back into view, an annoyed look on her face. He stepped away from the elf almost too quickly, and Rowan's expression darkened into a scowl. "This is Catriel," Maric offered lamely. Then he belatedly looked back at the elf. "And this is Lady Rowan, she is my betrothed." Catriel turned to Rowan and curtsied. "I am grateful to you, too, as well, my lady. I had asked them for help. It seems I should have been more careful." "I'll say," Rowan muttered. "Just what were you doing here at all?" "I had no other choice." The elf turned to Maric, subconsciously clutching the cloak tighter around her. "I had been looking for you, my lord. The horse I was given died not far from here. I ran the rest of the way, but there was so much chaos." Maric was confused. "You were looking for me?" From underneath the purple cloak, Catriel produced the package she carried. It appeared to be several scrolls bound in leather casings. "I came as quickly as I could. I am a messenger sent by the Earl of Amaranthine." Rowan's eyes went wide with alarm. A messenger? Catriel's green eyes lowered nervously. "His Grace has been defeated. I did not see it with my own eyes, but he said he would hold the attackers as long as he could. He said it was vital that I reach you, my lord." She held out the scrolls again, and Maric reluctantly took them. She seemed relieved, her charge fulfilled. "Defeated?" Rowan strode toward the elfin outrage. What are you talking about? When did this happen? 4 days ago, Catriel replied. I sped here on the horse I was given, and it died from exhaustion. But I had no choice. The same men that attacked his grace were not far behind me in the forest. She looked at Maric pleadingly. I had to reach you before they arrived, my lord. His grace said that was more important than anything. Maric took a step back, stunned. He opened one of the scrolls and it read. His eyes scanned the content even as it confirmed what his sinking gut was telling him. What? Rowan demanded. What does it say? For the love of the Maker. Face paled, he looked up at her. We sent Byron to draw their attention, and he got it. A full legion of chevaliers with mages. The king had to have planned it. And they're coming here? They're perhaps a day behind me, my lord, said Catriel. I wish I knew for certain. Maric and Rowan stared at each other unmoving. Overheard, the faint sound of thunder could be heard in the gray skies. Rain would prevent the spread of the fires in Gwern, though much damage had already been done. Fighting still raged inside the manor, and the town was in complete chaos. It would take more than a day to get the situation under control, and even if they did, the only routes of Gwern were out on the sea or back through the forest toward the approaching army. They were trapped.